Wade Cross used the very last $3 he owned to free a native woman from slavery, spending every cent to buy her freedom. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The trading post on the far edge of town looked beaten by years of hard weather. Sun-bleached boards warped and split-patched with whatever scraps the owner could scavenge. Rusted tin, a broken wagon wheel, even stretched hides to keep the light from leaking through. Inside, the air hung heavy with sweat, damp leather, stale tobacco, and the sour bite of old whiskey left on the floor. It was the sort of rough stop where men traded pelts for cheap liquor or grabbed supplies before riding back into the wild country. Wade pushed the door with his shoulder, the rusty hinges giving a long groan. Trail dust coated his boots, and the brim of his sweat-stained hat hid most of his face. Far from town, Wachiwi Sky stayed close to Boone Riker at the corral, handing him nails, her shoulder brushing his arm as though to remind him she was near. Since the last storm, their quiet understanding had deepened, unspoken but strong. One afternoon, a lone rider stopped at Boone's well for water and shared a piece of news with a casual grin. "Heard those Dust Creek riders got drunk again," he said. "Marshall's watching 'em close now, don't figure they'll try trouble twice." He tipped his hat and rode on. Boone lingered with the rope in hand relief, and a heavier thought pressing together. He told himself he'd ride in, grab what he needed, and leave before the evening crowd filled the post. But inside it wasn't as quiet as he hoped. At the far end, where sunlight slid through cracked boards, a man in a greasy vest yanked forward a young native woman. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, red welts deep on her skin. She was barefoot, toes raw from dust and splinters. Her deerskin dress clung in torn shreds, neckline ripped and side split, showing skin where the cloth had been dragged apart. Still, she held herself straight, breathing unevenly, black hair clinging to her face. The trader lifted her arm as if she were nothing but cargo. Strong enough to work, he barked through whiskey-thick breath. Quiet enough not to make trouble. You won't find better stock in this territory. The words made Wade's stomach knot. Men nearby murmured. One flipped a coin, another stared boldly at her. $2. 3. She stood motionless, chin lifted, refusing their eyes, though Wade saw her chest rise faster and her jaw tighten with every bid. His own hands clenched. He told himself it wasn't his fight. He had 2 horses, a half-fallen barn, and cattle that barely had feed. But he couldn't look away. The trader jerked the rope again. She stumbled, knee-striking the plank with a hollow crack. Pain crossed her face, but she steadied herself, pride holding her tall while fear flickered behind her eyes. Something twisted inside Wade. Memories of his lost sister flared, how he'd have killed any man who dared treat her like this. He thought of nights alone on his land, the silence he called freedom, but which often felt like punishment. Bidding climbed. Coins flashed in rough palms. The trader smirked, showing her off like livestock. Wade's hand touched the leather pouch at his belt. Just enough silver for flour beans and salt to last until spring if he stretched it. Spending it now meant hunger, maybe worse. Heart-pounding, he weighed his choice. Walk out and keep to himself, or stand his ground and risk everything. If he left, she'd belong to one of these men who cared nothing for mercy. Before his mind caught up, his boots were moving. "I'll take her," Wade said, voice hard and steady. The room fell silent. A few laughed, thinking it a joke. The trader squinted, then eyed the pouch Wade tossed down. Coins rang sharp across the table, everything he had. "Not much left in your pocket, cowboy," the trader sneered, sweeping the silver into his palm. "But it'll do." He shoved the rope into Wade's hand. For a heartbeat, Wade didn't move. He stared at the rough fibers, then at the woman. Her dark eyes cut to his suspicion first, but something else beneath it, a faint, hidden hope. She wasn't thanking him. She was asking why. He had no words. Loosening the knot so she could walk without tearing her skin, he murmured low, "Come on." Outside, the midday sun beat down on the dusty street. Prairie settlers paused to watch. Some muttered, others sneered. Wade ignored them, leading her to his horse. She hesitated, glanced at the animal, then at him. For a moment he thought she might run. Instead, she set her hand on the saddle and climbed up, unsteady but determined. Wade Cross swung into the saddle behind Wachiwi Sky, gathering the reins with a steady grip. He said nothing as he urged the horse forward, carrying them away from the trading post. He had no plan for the miles ahead, only the hard certainty that turning back had never been an option. The last of his money was gone, and he felt the weight of that gamble as the trail stretched out before them. The horse kept an easy ground-eating pace, hooves kicking up soft puffs of dust that glowed in the fading light. Behind them, the noises of town fell away, until nothing remained but the sweep of open country. Wade didn't glance back. He didn't need to. He could still sense the stares, the muttered judgments, the half-hidden laughter of men, convinced they knew why a cowboy would spend his final silver on a native woman. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was sharper and harder to name. In front of him, Wachiwi sat stiff and silent, her shoulders drawn tight, long black hair lifting in the evening breeze. She hadn't spoken since climbing onto the horse, and Wade hadn't expected her to. He kept a careful inch of space between them, his chest just clear of her back, but he felt the tension in her body like a deer poised to leap at the first wrong move. He wondered if she might run once they stopped. Part of him almost hoped she would, if freedom on her own terms was what she sought. Yet another part, the same iron in him that had made him step forward in the post, couldn't bear the thought of her vanishing barefoot into the dark hills with no food or shelter. They rode until the town shrank to a smudge behind them, and the land opened into rolling scrub and scattered mesquite. The sun bled down the horizon in rusty red shadows stretching long. His cabin wasn't far now, just a few miles along the creek bed, but the silence made every mile feel longer. Wade cleared his throat, the sound rough after hours, without words. "Name's Wade Cross," he said quietly. "I've got a place a ways out. Not fancy, but it's dry, and there's food." For a heartbeat, he thought she'd stay silent. Then, barely above the wind, she answered, "Wachiwi Sky." The name was quick-guarded, but sure. Wade gave a small nod she couldn't see. At least he had something to hold on to. As the trail darkened, he wondered how long she'd been bound and displayed like a prize. Who had taken her raiders, soldiers, men who hunted the weak for profit? He didn't ask. The rigid line of her back and the shallow rise of her breathing told him those questions would only build higher walls. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had thickened. The small, weather-worn house stood plain against the valley, its roof patched with rough boards, smoke stains darkening the stone chimney. It was no grand home, but it was his. Wade dismounted first, holding the reins, as Wachiwi slid down. She stepped carefully, her bare feet wincing on the packed earth. He noticed the raw cuts on her soles and thought about carrying her inside, but swallowed the urge. She might take pity for weakness, and he wouldn't risk her trust that way. Inside the one-room cabin was dim but warmer. Wade lit a lantern, its glow spilling across a rough-hewn table, a narrow cot, and a stone hearth still holding a faint bed of coals. The place smelled of smoke, leather, and the faint musk of horses. He hung his hat on a peg and crouched to coax the fire back to life. Wachiwi stayed near the door, back straight eyes sweeping every corner as if measuring each exit. She neither sat nor let her guard down. "I'll get food started," he said evenly. He filled a tin pot with water, added beans, and a pinch of salt. Years of solitary cooking made the motions second nature, but tonight he felt her watchful eyes on every movement. When the beans softened, he ladled them into a tin plate and set it on the table, then stepped back, folding his arms loosely. For a moment, she didn't move. Her gaze flicked from him to the food, suspicion sharp. At last, she stepped forward, testing each move like a trap, and lowered herself onto the bench. She ate with quiet care, yet the speed of each swallow betrayed real hunger. Wade cleaned his rifle on the far side of the room, giving her space. He knew the questions circling in her mind, why he had spent his last dollars, what he expected in return. He had no clean answer even for himself. He only knew that seeing her on that platform had ripped something deep inside him, something he couldn't have ignored without hating himself. When she finished, she set the spoon down with deliberate care. Wachiwi Sky finally lifted her eyes to Wade Cross for the first time since they had left the trading post. There was no gratitude in that look, only a sharp, measuring calm, as if she needed to know what kind of man he truly was. "You can bed down here by the fire," Wade said, his voice quiet but firm. "The cot's mine, but the floor stays warm. Tomorrow I'll ride to town for shoes. Then you can choose stay or leave when you're ready." She didn't answer right away. Her dark gaze lingered on him, then drifted back to the firelight. Wade stretched out on the cot with his boots still on, and his rifle propped within reach, turning over every choice that had brought her under his roof. He was flat broke now, with no plan for the lean weeks ahead. He had invited a stranger inside, a woman who had every reason to distrust men like him, and who might vanish at the first chance. Yet as he lay staring at the low rafters, listening to the faint rustle, as she settled near the hearth, something stirred inside him. The cabin no longer felt empty. Before dawn, he woke as he always did. Only the soft pop of coals broke the silence. Turning his head, he saw Wachiwi curled beneath the blanket, knees drawn tight, as if she had learned to make herself small. In the dim glow, he noticed the raw marks on her wrists, where ropes had cut deep. Wade swung his legs over the cot and pulled on his boots. Years of habit guided him. Rise early, split wood-tend horses, check the few head of cattle. But this morning, every step felt heavier. Would she still be there when he came back? Outside, the air bit sharp. His 80 acres looked wide and wild, but most of it was too dry for grazing. 2 horses, 3 cattle, a sagging barn fences that leaned with every wind, hardly enough to live on yet. Until yesterday, it had been enough. He worked the axe, each crack of wood echoing across the cold land, his mind circling the same question. What now? He had bought her freedom. But what was freedom without a path forward? She had no shoes, no supplies, and nowhere safe to go. He knew the Red Hawk clan had been forced north for winter, and soldiers still rode the hills. If she struck out alone, hunger, or worse, would find her. By the time he stepped back inside, a pale light edged the sky. Wachiwi was awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire, eyes sharp as the night before. She hadn't moved a thing, the tin plate from supper, still on the table, spoon set neat inside it. Her long hair fell loose around her shoulders, tangled, yet striking in the lantern's glow. "You hungry?" Wade asked, though he could see she hadn't eaten. She gave a slow shake of her head. He set about cooking more beans anyway. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He felt her gaze follow him, not with trust, but with a wary watchfulness, as if mapping every step and distance between them. When the beans were ready, he slid the plate toward her. This time she hesitated only a moment before eating quick and steady, though her back stayed straight, ready to bolt if need be. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," Wade said evenly. "Get you shoes, maybe a dress. You'll need both if you plan to stay or to leave." Her spoon paused. She studied him, testing the truth of those words. Was the choice really hers? He met her eyes and didn't flinch. Slowly, she set the spoon down. "I don't trust you," she said at last, her voice low and rough from a language learned the hard way. Wade nodded once. "Don't blame you." He offered no defense. Trust wasn't something he could buy with a handful of silver. She went back to eating slower now. Silence settled over them, heavy but not harsh. When she finished, he spoke again, calm and certain. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "Not food, not work, not what those men thought. You're free to leave. Just wait until you've got shoes and supplies so the land doesn't chew you up." Wachiwi's jaw tightened, and her eyes dropped to the fire. For the first time since he'd seen her on that platform, she looked less like stone and more like someone carrying a heavy private burden. She didn't speak yet. She didn't argue either. Later that morning, Wade saddled his horse and rode the fence line, glancing back toward the cabin more often than he liked to admit. He pictured her walking barefoot across the scrub feet, bleeding on sharp stones, the sun beating down with no water to drink. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to show. When he returned at midday, she was still there. The table had been tidied, fresh wood stacked by the hearth, and the floor swept clean with a willow branch she must have found outside. Small things unexpected, and they caught him off guard. He hadn't asked for them, hadn't expected them at all. For a moment, Wade Cross stood in the doorway watching Wachiwi sky move quietly around the cabin, and the sight unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. For years, this one-room shelter had echoed only with his own boots and breath. Now it carried hers, too. That night, when he spread a blanket near the hearth for her again, she hesitated. Her dark eyes lingered on him as he lay down on the cot. He felt the weight of that look, a silent testing, as if she waited for proof that he was no better than the men who had tried to buy her. Wade rolled to his side, facing the wall, keeping his hands clear and his breathing steady. Sleep took its time, but when it finally came, he sensed something new. Not comfort, not yet, but a shift in the silence, less empty, less cold. Morning broke sharp and clear, the kind of air that carries every sound for miles. Wade had been up since first light, scraping frost from the trough and checking the corral. His body followed old routines, but his mind kept circling back to the cabin. Each time he stepped away, he half expected to return and find it empty. Yet when he pushed open the door, she was still there, seated cross-legged near the fire. Her fingers worked steadily, stripping dried willow bark into thin strands and twisting them into a neat cord. The quiet focus of her task caught him off guard. She could have slipped away while he was bent over the horses or fetching water from the creek, but she hadn't. She stayed. He hung his hat on a peg and reached for a small sack of flour. As he measured out enough to fry flat cakes for breakfast, he felt her watching him. When he met her gaze, she looked quickly back to her work. "You could have run," Wade said at last, not accusing, just stating the truth. Her hand stilled, then moved again. No shoes. No water. No people. She answered after a pause, her English clipped, but clear. Nowhere to go. The words landed heavy. Wade knew that feeling too well. After the war, and after fever stole Ada Cross and their boy Luke, He had cut himself off working cattle until his back failed, and then scraping enough to buy a lost friend's land. Since then, he had lived small and silent, because speaking only reminded him of what was gone. He didn't tell her all that, but the memory pressed in as he set the skillet on the fire and let the smell of browning flour fill the room. "I'll ride into town later," he said. "Bring back shoes and a proper dress." Wachiwi's eyes dropped to the torn neckline of her deerskin. For the first time, he saw her lift a hand to cover her chest. She didn't thank him, but she didn't object. By mid-morning, Wade saddled his horse. He hesitated at the door. "You'll be safe here," he said. "Don't open up for anyone." "Who come?" she asked, tilting her head. Sometimes a trader or a neighbor might ride by, Wade replied, jaw tight. "Not often, but if they see you, folks will talk." He didn't need to explain what kind of talk. She understood. The ride to town felt long. Wade kept his hat low and his words few as he stepped into the dry goods store. He bought a plain cotton dress, sturdy, not fancy, and a pair of shoes that looked close to her size. When Zeke Porter, the storekeeper, raised an eyebrow, Wade ignored it and left with his bundle wrapped tight. Back at the cabin, Wachiwi sat where he'd left her, feeding small sticks into the fire. Suspicion shadowed her eyes when she saw the parcel. He placed it beside her without explanation. "For you." She touched the fabric carefully, unfolded it, then folded it back again, her face unreadable. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Wade worked outside, splitting wood, shoring up the sagging corral fence, patching the barn roof. Wachiwi stayed near the cabin, but each day she took on more small tasks, sweeping the dirt floor, carrying water from the creek in his dented pail, stirring beans when his hands were full. She did these things without being asked, and without show. It wasn't kindness, it was survival. At night they kept to opposite sides of the room, Wade on his cot, boots on rifle within reach. Wachiwi on her blanket near the fire. They spoke little, but the quiet between them softened. It no longer felt like a wall ready to break. In that stillness, they began to sense each other's rhythms. Wade noticed how she held herself proud despite weariness, and the slight limp from the knee she'd bruised on the trading post floor. He wondered about old beatings, but didn't ask. He also saw her eyes ease a fraction when she tended the horses, the only time she looked less guarded, and Wachiwi studied him in return, how he worked slow and steady, never crowding her, never raising his voice, always setting his tools in the same place and muttering at stubborn fence posts. She saw that he never reached for her without cause. It didn't erase the memories she carried, but it was different from anything she had expected. On the fourth day, Wade Cross was mending the gate when a lone rider crossed the ridge beyond the creek. One glance told him it was Boone Riker's talkative neighbor Jed Pike, the kind of man who spread news faster than prairie fire. Wade's chest tightened. If Jed caught a glimpse of Wachiwi sky gossip, would reach town before sundown. He stepped inside, boots heavy on the plank floor. "Someone Wachiwi?" asked, looking up from where she sat, mending the hem of her new dress with a cord she had twisted herself. Neighbor Wade said quietly, "Stay clear of the window." Her brows drew tight, but she obeyed, melting into the deeper shadows of the corner. Wade stayed near the door until the sound of hoofbeats faded down the trail. Only then did he let out a slow breath. He knew it was just a matter of time before someone came asking questions. That night, as firelight flickered between them, Wachiwi finally voiced the thought she had carried since the first night. "Why you do this? Why spend your coins?" Wade stared into the flame's voice, low and steady. Couldn't stomach watching. That's all. She studied him, eyes searching for a hidden bargain. In her world, men didn't give without expecting. Wade offered nothing more, just leaned back, folded his arms, and shut his eyes against the fire's glow. The quiet that followed felt different than before, still, but not empty. By the fifth morning, life inside the cabin had settled into a rhythm he hadn't expected. The chores stayed the same. Splitting wood, hauling water, boiling beans, but the silence had changed. Now 2 sets of footsteps crossed the worn floor. Wachiwi's careful sweeping the soft tread to the creek, the gentle clatter of her spoon in the pot, small sounds that wove themselves into the day. Her strength returned little by little. The hollow look left her face after steady meals. The rope burns on her wrists scabbed over, though she rubbed them absent-mindedly as if memory still pressed there. Her feet, once torn and bruised, remained tender. Wade noticed the faint wince when she crossed the hard-packed dirt and left the shoes he had bought near her blanket without a word. A few days later, she began wearing them, taking short steps outside to break them in. He never pressed her about the past, where she came from, how she was taken. The answers would come when she was ready, or not at all. What mattered was that she was here. Still, word was beginning to spread. On a supply run, Wade felt every stare weigh heavier. Zeke Porter, the storekeeper, asked fewer questions than his eyes did. A pair of Dust Creek riders lounging near the saloon muttered his name, their voices low, but their laughter sharp. He ignored them, though heat burned in his gut. Jed Pike must have told what he'd seen, and gossip travels fast on the prairie. When Wade rode back home, he found Wachiwi by the corral, one hand brushing the flank of his gelding. She looked up as he dismounted, wary yet calmer than when she first arrived. Seeing her outside set him on edge. If a neighbor had spotted her once, they could again. But he said nothing, only handed her the small bundle he carried, salt coffee, and a strip of dried pork. That evening, she was the first to speak. "They talk," she said quietly. Wade met her gaze a little surprised. Some, he admitted. Bad talk. He stared into the fire, weighing his reply. "Most folks don't understand. They don't care to. But this is my land and my cabin. They don't get to decide who I share it with." She held his eyes for a long moment, unreadable, then looked back at the fire. The question lingered between them, how long before gossip turned to real trouble. Days slid into a steady rhythm. Wachiwi saved him a portion of beans without being asked. When he returned from the fence line, fresh wood was already stacked by the hearth. They spoke little, but each small act carried quiet meaning. At night, the cabin felt different. He stayed on the cot. She kept to the blanket near the fire. Sometimes when the flames sank low, he caught himself watching the soft rise and fall of her breathing. He told himself to look away, and mostly he did, but the image stayed with him. One evening, while Wade sat repairing a saddle strap, Wachiwi moved past to reach a shelf. Her hip brushed his shoulder, barely a touch, yet enough to make him pause. She neither flinched nor hurried, and he forced his hands back to the leather. Wachiwi, in turn, studied him in quiet moments. The way long days in the sun carved lines across his face, how his shirt clung with sweat while he worked the calm precision of his hands as he mended tools on the brink of breaking. She never let him catch her watching, but at night, as he turned away on the cot, her gaze lingered in the fading glow. Then came a night when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low. Wachiwi pulled the blanket tight, yet a shiver ran through her. Wade noticed and sat up. "Need another blanket?" She looked at him, eyes sharp, then softened. "You give everything coins, food, clothes." "Why?" The question struck deeper than he expected. Wade looked down at his calloused hands, the leather strap forgotten, and searched for words that would not come easy. Wade Cross spoke at last, his words slow and measured. "Because I couldn't leave you there. That's reason enough." Wachiwi Sky searched his face as if testing every word. Finally, she gave a small nod and drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She didn't thank him aloud, but Wade noticed the tension ease just a little. For him, the cabin no longer felt like a stopover between long days of labor. Something had changed. Each sound, each shared glance, carried weight. Trust was still a distant trail, yet she had stayed one day, then another, and that choice mattered. As firelight painted soft shadows across her strong features, Wade sensed something he hadn't felt in years. The silence between them had shifted from mere survival to the faint beginning of something neither of them could name. The days that followed held a quiet tension. Chores stayed the same, but the air carried longer looks and small pauses, the brush of hands when they passed a cup or tool. Wade kept his distance careful and deliberate, but he felt the pull all the same. One morning, as he saddled his horse to ride into town for grain, Wachiwi stood framed in the doorway. She wore the plain cotton dress he'd bought, cinched with a strip of leather cord. It fit her better than the torn deerskin, but faint rope marks still shadowed her bare shoulders. He caught himself looking too long before forcing his eyes away. "You need anything?" he asked evenly. She frowned slightly, testing his intent. "No." He gave a brief nod and mounted up. She remained in the doorway until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Town felt colder this trip. The whispers had hardened into something sharper. As Wade stepped past the saloon, a man muttered loud enough to carry. "Cross has got himself a squaw out there. Paid for her same as you'd buy a mule." Ugly laughter followed. Wade's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He finished his errands in silence and headed home, the words clinging like burrs the whole ride back. When he opened the cabin door, the smell of stew met him. Dried pork simmered with beans. Wachiwi glanced up from the fire eyes, reading the strain on his face. "They speak of me," she said quietly, more statement than question. "They don't know you," Wade answered, setting the grain sack aside. "They don't matter. Words matter," she said, stirring harder than necessary. "They follow." He didn't argue. Leaning against the wall, arms folded, he said simply, "Let them talk. My land, my home, not theirs." The resolve in his voice eased something in her, though a shadow of doubt lingered in her eyes. That night, the wind rattled the shutters. Wade added another log to the fire and sat oiling his rifle while Wachiwi mended her dress with a slender cord. The quiet between them softened like slow-falling snow. When she finished, she laid the dress aside and spoke low. "The man who sold me. He came with soldiers. Took many. Some killed, others worse. They sell us like cattle. Use us." She paused, then forced out the last words. "You paid too, but you are not like them." Wade's hands stilled on the rifle barrel. Her words cut deep and clean. He set the gun down gently. "I didn't buy you to own you," he said. "I paid to stop them." She searched his face for the slightest crack of falsehood. Finding none, she gave a faint nod, though a trace of mistrust still lingered. She wrapped the blanket tighter and turned back to the fire. Later that night, when the flames burned low, Wade noticed her shivering. He hesitated, then rose and took another wool blanket from the trunk. "You'll be warmer with this," he said, holding it out. Her wary eyes softened as she reached for it. Their fingers brushed, and the brief touch lingered longer than either expected. Wade felt his breath catch before he stepped back to his cot, lowering himself stiffly and staring at the dark ceiling while thoughts stormed inside him. By morning, something subtle had shifted again. Wachiwi moved with less caution, no longer like a cornered animal. She even asked a bit shyly how to grind corn into meal. He showed her their hands meeting briefly on the stone. She pulled back, but without the sharpness of earlier days. That evening, as they shared supper, she studied him across the table. "You live alone long time," she said. He nodded. "Since the war. Since my wife and boy Ada and Luke died." He spoke it plain without ornaments. Her eyes softened. "Why me then? Because no one should be left like that while I can help it," Wade replied, steady and sure. The silence that followed was different, deep, but warm. Later, when the fire burned low, Wade lay on the cot and Wachiwi on her blanket. In the hush, he heard her shift, and then her voice came soft through the dark. "You are not like the others." The words landed deep, and Wade Cross could barely find breath to answer. Something long buried cracked open inside him. For the first time since Wachiwi Sky had come into his life, he no longer feared she might leave. What unsettled him now was what it would mean if she chose to stay. Morning broke clear after a restless night. Wade had hardly slept, her quiet voice echoing in his head. "You are not like the others." By dawn, his chest felt tight with the weight of it. He pulled on his boots and stepped into the cold, going through the motions of work, while his thoughts kept circling back to her. Wachiwi was already awake, crouched by the hearth, feeding slender sticks to the fire. She glanced up when he passed, their eyes meeting briefly before she looked away, drawing the blanket closer, though the room no longer felt so cold. There was color in her cheeks now, proof that steady food and rest were working. The sight eased him, and at the same time held his gaze longer than he meant. He forced himself outside to work. He spent the morning replacing broken rails along the corral, each swing of the hammer a steady counter to the storm in his mind. Still, thoughts of her kept threading through the rhythm of the job, how she moved in the cabin with quiet assurance, now less like a stranger, more like someone slowly finding her place. When Wade came back at midday, the cabin smelled of beans and pork stew. Wachiwi had set 2 plates without waiting to be asked. They ate mostly in silence, the fire snapping between them, but the air seemed alive. He caught her looking at him once or twice, quick and uncertain, and when he met her gaze, she turned away. After the meal, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "Before I was taken, I had a husband. He died when soldiers came. My people scattered." The words were spare but heavy. "I thought I would die too." Wade kept his eyes on her, the fork still in his hand. He didn't press for more. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "You lost too," she said, meeting his gaze. He gave a short nod. "Wife and boy. Fever took them." The room fell quiet, 2 losses side by side. That night the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Wade sat near the fire, mending a rope, while Wachiwi lay on her blanket. She shifted once, then again, finally sitting up. "Too cold," she murmured, almost apologetic. Wade looked at her, then at the cot. He hesitated. "The cot's warmer. I can take the floor." She studied him for a long moment and shook her head. "No, you stay. I stay here." He lay back down, but heard her still shivering. At last he got up, lifted a wool blanket from the trunk, and draped it gently across her. Her eyes opened at the touch, dark and searching. For an instant their hands brushed warmth, meeting warmth. He felt the spark before pulling back and returning to his cot. The next day, while Wade worked outside, a rider appeared on the ridge, Jed Pike again. This time he slowed, reining in his horse to watch Wade drive nails into the fence. A knowing smirk played on his face. "Heard you've got company out here, Cross," he called. "Word is she's Apache." That true Wade straightened hammer still in hand. "Not your concern, Jed." Jed chuckled and spat in the dust. "Town's saying plenty a man living alone bringing home a woman he bought off a trader. Folks can say what they like," Wade said, jaw tight. He stepped closer to the fence, his voice carrying steel. "You mind your land. I'll mind mine." Jed lingered, eyes sharp with curiosity, then turned his horse and rode off. Wade watched him disappear, unease gnawing. He knew those words wouldn't stop at the ridge they'd spread like fire through dry grass. Back inside Wachiwi, noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Trouble?" she asked. "Just talk," he said, hanging his hat on the peg. "But talk can turn ugly. Stay close to the cabin. Don't show yourself unless you have to." Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm not afraid." Admiration stirred in Wade, despite himself. She had endured more than most, yet she still stood proud. That evening, the firelight threw long shadows on the walls. Wade sat near the hearth rifle within reach, while Wachiwi stirred the pot. When she leaned forward, the neckline of her dress slipped the fabric worn thin. For a heartbeat, his eyes caught chest tightening, but he forced them away. Respect was all that held him steady, and he clung to it. Yet she had noticed. She turned her head slightly, her dark gaze meeting his in the flicker of firelight. She didn't pull the fabric back, didn't hide. Instead, she held his gaze, her face unreadable testing. Wade's throat felt dry. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, his voice came rough and sure. "You're safe here." Don't ever doubt that Wade Cross said, his voice low and steady. Wachiwi Sky's eyes softened, just a flicker, but enough. She turned back to the fire, the corner of her mouth tightening as though she were holding something inside. That night, Wade couldn't sleep. He lay on the cot, listening to the quiet, and feeling her presence like a pulse in the room. After a long while, she spoke into the dark. "I think maybe you're different. Not all men are the same." He swallowed hard, staring at the rafters. "I'm not perfect," he said, "but I'll never hurt you." Silence followed, rich and alive with something fragile and new. For the first time since she'd stepped into his life, Wade dared to believe she might truly choose to stay. The days that followed carried a different weight. He noticed it in the way Wachiwi moved about the cabin steps, slower, glances longer, words measured as if she weighed each one. Most of all, he felt it at night, when the fire sank low and every breath in the small room seemed too loud. The morning after Jed Pike's visit, Wade stood by the corral, checking the fence, while his mind replayed the neighbors' taunts. He'd long since stopped caring what people thought of him, but the thought of anyone speaking of Wachiwi as if she were property made his jaw clench. He couldn't silence their tongues, but he carried a quiet vow to keep her safe. Inside, Wachiwi had begun to claim small corners of the cabin as her own. Each morning she folded her blanket neatly. Each evening she set the cooking pot in its place on the hearth. She even repaired one of Wade's shirts, the one ripped at the elbow, stitching it unevenly but strong. He wore it the next day without a word, and she noticed. No one spoke of it, but it meant more than words. That noon she set 2 plates without waiting for him. They ate in a silence that felt charged, and Wade caught her watching him once or twice before she quickly turned aside. After the meal she spoke, voice steady but heavy. "Before I was taken, I had a husband. He died when soldiers came. My people scattered. I thought I would die too." Wade listened, fork motionless. The simple fact that she shared so much told him something inside her had shifted. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. He come back. Maybe she asked. Maybe Wade admitted. But I'll handle it. Her eyes narrowed a little. You protect me. Why? He set the knife down and met her gaze. Because you deserve it. Simple as that. For a moment she didn't move. Her eyes held his, weighing those words against every betrayal she had known. Then she turned back to the fire, lips pressed tight, but shoulders easing. That night a hard wind battered the cabin. Wachiwi lay near the hearth, but could not find rest. Wade watched her curl tighter against the chill. At last he rose, carrying his own blanket, and knelt beside her. You'll freeze if you don't take this, he said. She looked up, suspicion flickering into something warmer. And you? I'll be fine. His tone left no room for doubt. Slowly she reached for the blanket. Their fingers brushed, this time lingering, and she spread the cover over herself. After a pause, she shifted it slightly, leaving space. Her eyes lifted, a question unspoken. Wade's throat went dry. His whole body longed to close that distance, but he held back until she whispered, I'm not afraid. The word struck deeper than he expected. Out on the ridge the next day, Jed Pike reappeared, calling across the open ground with a smirk. Heard you've got company out here, Cross. Word is she's Apache. That true Wade straightened hammer still in hand. Not your concern, Jed. Jed chuckled, spitting in the dust. Town's saying plenty a man living alone bringing home a woman he bought off a trader. Folks can say what they like, Wade replied, his voice edged with steel. You mind your land, I'll mind mine. Jed lingered a heartbeat, eyes sharp with curiosity, then wheeled his horse and rode off. Wade watched him disappear, knowing those words would spread like fire on dry grass. That evening inside the cabin, the storm pressed close. Wachiwi fed the fire, while Wade sat near the hearth rifle propped within reach. She leaned forward to stir the pot. The neckline of her dress slipped, slightly worn soft by use. Wade's breath caught, but he forced his eyes away. Respect held him steady. Still, she turned her dark gaze, catching his in the firelight. She didn't move to hide, didn't pull the fabric back. Instead, she held his eyes silent and unflinching. Something passed between them, then quiet, certain. Wade crossed the small space, heart pounding, and their lips met in a kiss that was soft, hesitant, and real, an unspoken choice sealed in the hush of the winter night. Wade Cross lifted his hand, resting it lightly at Wachiwi Sky's waist. He kept it there, letting her choose the next move. When she didn't pull away, when she leaned in and deepened the kiss, something locked tight inside him for years finally broke loose. For so long, he had lived in silence and loss, convinced nothing could ever fill the emptiness Ada and Luke's passing had left. Yet here in this storm-lit cabin, with a woman who had every reason to mistrust men, he felt life flow back into him. When they drew apart, Wachiwi rested her forehead against his. Her voice came low. You keep saying safe, now I believe. Wade swallowed hard, his palm still warm against her waist. And I'll keep proving it, he said. Respect was the line he refused to cross, and he clung to it. But she noticed the restraint. Turning slightly, her dark eyes caught his in the fire's glow. She didn't pull the dress higher. She didn't move to hide. Instead, she held his gaze, testing him in silence. Wade's throat went dry. He started to speak, then stopped. At last, his voice came rough but sure. You're safe here. Don't ever doubt that. Her eyes softened just enough to show she believed him. She looked back to the fire, the corner of her mouth tightening as if holding back more words. That night, Wade lay awake on the cot, listening to the quiet and the steady sound of her breathing. He knew the world outside would never see her as he did. To them, she would always be the Apache woman he'd brought home. But she had chosen to stay another night, and now another morning. That choice meant more than any neighbor's judgment. The storm passed, and dawn broke with a rare stillness. Wade stepped into the yard, his boots sinking into rain-soft earth. The air smelled of wet mesquite and clean sky. Inside, Wachiwi moved with quiet purpose, folding blankets, tidying the table, stoking the fire. Her presence no longer carried uncertainty. She worked with the calm of someone who had already decided, though she hadn't spoken the words. All morning, Wade repaired the corral fence. His hands swung the hammer steady, but his mind kept circling back to the night before, the warmth of her touch, the sure sound of her voice when she said she believed him. Years had passed since he'd let anyone that close. He didn't regret a moment. By midday, as he carried water from the creek, 3 riders appeared on the ridge, Jed Pike, in the lead with 2 men at his side. They reined in just out of reach, eyes fixed on the cabin. A knot tightened in Wade's gut. He set the bucket down slowly, his fingers brushing the butt of his revolver, though he didn't draw. "Cross," Jed called, voice carrying over the wet ground. "Folks in town say you've got a squaw holed up in there. Say you bought her. We don't take kindly to that." Wade planted his boots in the mud and faced them square on. "What I do on my land is my business." One of the men snorted. "You think you can bring one of them here and call it normal people are talking? Ain't right." "She's free," Wade said, voice low but cutting. "She stays because she chooses to. Any man says different can answer to me." Silence settled the 3 men, shifting in their saddles. Wade's hand hovered near his revolver, his stance unshaken. At last, Jed spat into the mud and jerked his reins. "You'll regret it, Cross," he muttered, turning his horse. The others followed their silhouettes, fading over the ridge. Only then did Wade draw a long breath. He turned back toward the cabin. Wachiwi stood in the doorway, her face unreadable, but steady. She had heard every word. That evening, after chores were done, they sat by the fire. The quiet between them felt charged, but no longer fragile. Wachiwi stirred the pot absently, eyes far away. Finally, she said, "If I stay, they hate you more." "Let them," Wade replied, leaning forward on his knees. "I've lived with people's hate before. It won't change what I do." She studied him, lips pressed tight. "You want me to stay?" His throat tightened, but his answer came without hesitation. "Yes. Not because I bought you, not out of pity, because I want you here with me." For a long moment she was silent, firelight flickering across her strong features. Then she nodded, slow and certain. "Then I stay." The words fell with quiet weight. Wade felt something in his chest finally loosen. Reaching into the small trunk at the foot of his cot, he pulled out something he had worked on that afternoon, an offering for the life they were beginning together. A narrow band of iron, hammered smooth, and shaped by the same hands that had raised every beam of the cabin. Wade Cross held it out, a little awkward, but steady. "It ain't much," he said quietly, "but it's what I can give a promise." Wachiwi Sky's eyes widened in the firelight as she turned the ring between her fingers. Then she looked back at him, voice calm and sure. "I wear it because I choose." Wade slid the iron band onto her finger, his calloused hand trembling just enough to betray the weight of the moment. She didn't look away. Slowly she leaned forward, her lips finding his. This kiss was deeper, carrying not only need, but the belonging and resolve of 2 people deciding their own future. That night they lay together not as strangers thrown together by chance, but as two souls who had chosen to stay. Wade wrapped his arm around her waist, feeling her rest against him, without tension or fear. In the darkness she whispered, "No one take me now. Not while I breathe." He answered, his voice rough and certain. In the days that followed, gossip in town swelled like storm clouds, but Wade paid it no mind. He rode in only when necessary, and when men muttered, he let their words die in the dust. He had survived war loss and years of lonely silence. No talk in a saloon could break him now. Spring worked its quiet changes on the land. Grass pushed through the wet earth, and Wachiwi pressed seeds into the soil by the porch, her slender hands giving life back to ground long left bare. She laughed once, when the gelding balked at the fence, and the sound filled Wade's chest with a warmth he thought he'd never feel again. The cabin no longer stood as a solitary shelter for a weary man. It had become a home. Each night the fire burned for two instead of one, and when Wade lay beside Wachiwi, her hand resting over the iron ring he had made, he knew with unshakable certainty that his life had turned the day he spent his last silver. He hadn't bought her. He had freed her, and in return, she had given him something he believed was lost forever, a family built not by blood or law, but by choice. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.